of July here in South Korea, and you're watching Arirang News. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kwon Jang-ho. President MoonJae-in was in India and Singapore last week. During his visit, he laid out his vision for future cooperation with the two Asian nations in what he has dubbed the New Southern Policy. The aim is to build stronger diplomatic and economic ties with non-traditional partners. This is perhaps particularly important right now due to the trade war being waged between the world's two largest superpowers, the US and China. We'll discuss President MoonJae-in's New Southern Policy further and its implications with an expert in the studio later. But first, we catch up with the latest headlines with our Devin Whiting at our news centre. Devin?
Hi, Jang-ho. President Moon has ordered his military to immediately turn in all documents drafted by a military intelligence unit that detailed plans to declare martial law if protests grew violent, following a court ruling in March 2017 that would determine the fate of conservative then-President Park Geun-hye. Here's the Blue House spokesperson.
President Moon said although the case will be investigated strictly and fairly by the Defense Minister's special team, as the commander-in-chief, he needs to find out what really happened and whether the martial law plan had been ready to the level of execution.
The president's order comes amid an ongoing probe into revelations this past week of a document showing the military's Defense Security Command in late 2016 drafted plans to mobilize troops to suppress protests and crack down on rallies and candlelight vigils against then-President Park. Lawmakers had impeached Park over broad corruption allegations in December 2016. The plans to deploy troops were never carried out. On Sunday, North Korea and the United States held a big meeting to discuss returning the remains of American soldiers who never made it back from the Korean War. It seems the talks went well. They've agreed to start searching again in the North for the soldiers' remains, and reports say they'll be looking to send over around 200 sets of remains in the next few weeks. Park Hee-jun reports.
North Korea and the U.S. have agreed to resume joint field operations to search for the remains of more than 5,000 American troops who were killed during the Korean War, a result of their meeting on Sunday at the inter-Korean border. Following the meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said in a statement that the talks were productive and cooperative and resulted in firm commitments. U.S. President Donald Trump also took to Twitter to hail the progress being made with North Korea. The repatriation of American soldiers was one of the agreements reached during the Kim-Trump summit in Singapore in mid-June. Talks to implement the agreement were originally planned for Thursday last week, but were delayed after the North Korean representatives failed to show up. They later called the UN command, asking to reschedule for Sunday and to involve military generals, which resulted in the first general-level military talks between the two sides in 9 years. And on Monday, working-level talks are set to take place to iron out the details of the repatriation, including the transfer of remains that have already been collected in North Korea. Citing an unnamed U.S. official, CNN reports that the two sides are aiming to transfer the remains of some 200 American troops within the next 2 to 3 weeks. The U.S. already has 100 wooden caskets waiting at Panmunjom to carry the soldiers' remains back home. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
President Trump recently raised eyebrows with a tweet that said North Korea no longer poses a nuclear threat. His national security advisor, John Bolton, has now clarified that the president meant that in a context where Pyongyang lives up to its denuclearization commitments. Bolton said that on Sunday in an interview with ABC News when he was asked about the tweet Trump posted after his historic summit in Singapore with Kim Jong-un. Meanwhile, the White House has canceled Bolton's scheduled interview with CNN. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders said this was because of a CNN reporter's, quote, bad behavior during a joint press conference in the UK. South Korea's finance minister and the head of Korea's central bank met this morning in the hope of dealing with a number of economic risks, including the rising trade tensions between the U.S. and China and weak job growth here at home. Won Jung-hwan reports.
Finance Minister Kim Dong-yeon and Bank of Korea Governor Lee Ju-yeol agreed on Monday to take preemptive measures against a number of risks facing the country's economy. At their 7th round of policy talks since Kim Dong-yeon took office in June last year, Kim expressed his concerns that the latest minimum wage increase could be a burden on the Korean economy in the second half of this year. South Korea's minimum wage for next year has been set at nearly $7.50 per hour, up 10.9% from this year. The two also shared concerns on the growing external and internal risk to the Korean economy, including the escalating trade tensions between Washington and Beijing, and the country's sluggish job growth figures. Given that China and the U.S. are Korea's top two trading partners, accounting for 37% of Korea's exports, the BOK chief and finance minister agreed to evaluate the impact of the trade spat on the Korean economy and cooperate through a mix of preemptive monetary and fiscal policies to ensure stable growth. They also highlighted the need for policies to tackle sluggish job creation. Between January and June, a monthly average of 142,000 new jobs were added, the slowest growth since the 2008 global financial crisis. The talks come a few days after the BOK held its key rate steady for July and lowered its growth forecast for this year by 0.1% to 2.9%, and 2 days before the finance ministry is set to release its economic policy measures for the second half of 2018. 원정환, 아리랑 뉴스.
A group of delegates appointed by President Moon have returned from a 2-day trip to North Korea, where they followed it up on a 3-way project involving the two Koreas and Russia. It's been stalled for several years, but the plan is to eventually have Russian coal sent through the north down to South Korea. Go Yun-hee reports.
South Korea's Presidential Committee on Northern Economic Cooperation wrapped up its 2-day trip to North Korea on Sunday. Following an invitation from Pyongyang's Economic Cooperation Committee, 11 South Koreans led by the chairman Song Young-gil traveled to the northeastern border region of Naseon. They also checked out the local industrial area, including Najin Port. The committee met with North Korean and Russian officials to discuss the Najin-Hasan project, a trilateral logistics project involving South Korea, North Korea, and Russia. Russian coal will be brought by railway from Russia's Hasan to North Korea's Najin port and then brought down to South Korea via cargo ship. The project was trialed a few times in 2014 and 2015, but came to a halt after North Korea's nuclear missile test in 2016. According to the committee, it's the first time this project was discussed between South and North Korea, despite having been discussed numerous times between South Korea and Russia. Chairman Song added the government will keep preparing for joint studies to kickstart the project again, once discussions about lifting sanctions begin. Meanwhile, preparations are continuing not only for possible inter-Korean economic cooperation, but for civil exchanges as well. Members of South Korea's Council for Reconciliation and Cooperation left for a 3-day trip to North Korea on Monday. They are to talk with their North Korean counterparts about bringing back from Japan the remains of Koreans who were forced into labor during Japan's colonial rule in the early 1900s. The two sides are also looking to strengthen communication through measures like setting up a joint liaison office. The council stressed that it will make sure to pave the way for future inter-Korean civil exchanges. 고르니, 아리랑 뉴스.
Now, if you're in Korea, you've been baking along with the rest of us. Today's been the hottest day so far this summer, with almost the entire country under heat wave alerts or warnings. This afternoon in Seoul, the mercury hit 34 degrees Celsius. The hottest place again was Daegu at 37 degrees, while Gwangju broke 35 degrees. The heat caused a rise in dangerous cases of heat stroke and dehydration, so do make sure to take precautions if you're spending time outdoors. It's going to stay extremely hot through the rest of the week. I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines at this hour.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, President MoonJae-in returned from his trip to India and Singapore last week, during which he promoted his vision for cooperation with the two Asian nations, building on what he calls his new Southern policy. Before we delve deeper into the subject, let's take a look at some of what he said during his visits.
저는 인도와의 관계를 한반도 주변 4대 강국 수준으로 끌어올리려고 합니다. 그 의지를 담은 것이 신남방 정책입니다. 신남방 정책은 단순한 경제 협력을 넘어 더불어 잘 사는 사람 중심의 평화 공동체를 함께 만들고자 하는 것입니다. 저는 이것을 사람, 상생번영, 평화의 3P로 제시했습니다. 신남방 정책은 모디 총리님이 추진하는 신동방 정책과도 맞닿아 있습니다. 신동방 정책과 신남방 정책은 아시아 전체의 번영으로 완성될 것입니다. 한국에게 아세안은 평화 공동체를 함께 만들어갈 동반자입니다. 함께 경제 발전을 이뤄낼 교역 파트너이자 투자 대상국입니다. 신남방 정책은 싱가포르를 포함한 동남아시아 국가들과 사람, 상생 번영, 평화를 위한 미래 파트너십을 구축하는 것입니다. 더 많이, 더 자주 사람이 만나고 실질적 협력을 위해 상생 번영의 기회를 넓히며 한반도와 아세안을 넘어 세계 평화에 함께 기여하고자 하는 것입니다.
Now, to further discuss President Moon's new Southern policy vision, we have with us Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
Now, during President Moon's visit to India and Singapore, he talked extensively about the new Southern policy. Can you explain to our viewers what he's talking about?
Okay, well, the idea behind the new Southern policy is closer economic and political cooperation between the what he's calling the new South area, which is the ASEAN group of 10 countries plus India and other core economies, core countries which concerns the region, such as Korea, Japan, China, United States, and the mid-Asian countries such as Mongolia. So it's a very regional type of plan. It encompasses not only economics but politics, but I'm just going to stick to the economics here. The ASEAN group of 10 countries is a very interesting group of countries because it includes not only advanced countries like Singapore and up-and-coming countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, but also low-income countries which have vast potential, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. And if you take the ASEAN region as a whole, as a bloc, then they're right now the 7th largest economy in the world and 3rd largest population in the world. And then India is the second largest country in the world in terms of population. It's 6th largest country in the world in terms of GDP. And it has, since 2014, it has growth rates higher than 7%. So it's a vastly up-and-coming region. Now, one of the goals of this new Southern policy in terms of economics is increasing the trade in that area. So he wants to bring up the trade with the new Southern countries up to the level of China, which is about $200 billion. Korea right now, the trade between the two Korea and those regions are about $170 billion. So it's well within reach. And especially with Vietnam, they have come up, they have emerged as one of the Korea's largest trading partners. Last year, it was Korea's 4th largest trading partner and 3rd largest export destination.
What's the difference with previous such policies in the region? Is it the fact that they've grouped it together to say this is the whole new southern area?
Well, ASEAN has been a bloc for a while, but in the last 10 years or so, they've really been aggressive in trying to take regional leadership, both economic and politics, in the region. And India as well, under the last 2 prime ministers, Prime Minister Singh and the current Prime Minister Modi, they have been making very good progress in economic development. And since we have a lot of problems with China and the United States right now, those 2 regions seem to be a good market for us to go into, especially because, well, United States is a mature market. China demographics are getting old, so they're bound to shrink in terms of population within the next decade or so. But both India and ASEAN have very young profile, demographic profile, so they'll be if they keep up the current type of policies, then they can emerge as a major player in the future. And because Korea has a more advanced technology than most of the ASEAN countries and Indian region, I think Korea has can set itself up in very good position to maybe replace or supplement China and United States in the future.
You talk about that economic problems, difficulties that we're having with China and the US because of their ongoing trade war and its ripple effects. But do you think the new Southern policy can counteract that? Because, as you said, it seems to be an act to try and diversify South Korea's trading partners.
Okay, well, we already have an FTA and CEPA with ASEAN and India. But these two FTAs are a bit special because other FTAs try to eliminate tariffs, but because these two regions are still considered very developing regions, the FTAs here sought to reduce tariffs rather than eliminate them. So there's a lot of more room for liberalization. And then in addition to that, because they have such young profile, they can be counted on as a market for next few decades. But the problem is they're not easy marks. They are developing countries, but they do expect mutual benefit. And right now, Korea has a substantial trade surplus with both of them. So they're going to have to work out better ways to have a win-win scenario where there's mutual gains. And there has been some renegotiation to try to deepen the relationship, deepen the FTAs with both of these regions. It's become sort of stuck. It's become sort of murky, but hopefully the state visits here will act to accelerate the process.
You talk about those state visits. I mean, he was very busy going to various places over several days. Do you think he achieved what he wanted to do while he was over there? I mean, do you think India and Singapore got the message that he was sending?
Okay, well, they did sign some MOUs, but compared to, say, other state visits, they're mostly more diplomatic and mostly geared toward the future than having anything in the place concrete right now. But India is known as a tough market. You have to go in and stay there for a long time before you make a profit. So I think the idea here is to develop the market for the future rather than do anything for right now. And that's probably a good strategic move because, as I said before, both of these regions are not easy marks.
Part of President Moon's message when talking about the new Southern policy was also about North Korea as well, actually. He said that if the Korean Peninsula becomes denuclearized again, all of Asia will benefit. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, North Korea nuclear weapons have been acting as a destabilizing element in the region. So if that disappears, that's going to remove one major thorn in Asian economy and politics. Having said that, though, if you want North Korea to denuclearize, it not only depends on Korea and the United States, it'll depend on a lot of other countries as well, Japan, China, and even the ASEAN and Indian region, because, well, we've been using economic development as sort of a carrot. And right now, if you want to industrialize, then you have to globalize. So you have to plug yourself into the global supply chain. And if you want to do that, you do need a lot of regional cooperation. Korea, I think, has goodwill among the Asian countries, but North Korea does not. So this might be one way of trying to start building a good reputation for North Korean economic development.
And it will be beneficial for South Korea as well, I'm guessing.
Well, South Korea has a lot of stake in this. If North Korea does become sort of an economic union with South Korea, that will mean a lot of inexpensive labor for Korean companies. It'll mean a lot of infrastructure investment that Korean construction companies can take care of. And there's rumors of a lot of natural resources, rare earth, minerals that Korean companies can take advantage of. But right now, we don't know exactly what the extent of that advantages will be. So we'll have to calculate it. But one thing I am concerned about, this does not have to do with new Southern policies particularly, but I think it's a big change. It's a big transition, and there's going to be a lot of social problems, and I think we do need to start talking about that.
Let's move on to some other headlines that are important right now. For example, the US-China trade war. We touched on it earlier, but it's continuing to wage on. But so far, the markets have been rattled, but there's been no real significant impact so far, it seems. How do you think it will play out?
Okay, well, on paper, United States has the advantage. China exports $505 billion to the United States, while the U.S. only exports $130 billion to China. And U.S. is, at least on paper, much bigger economy, $20 trillion, and it's less dependent on trade than China. And right now, the actual amount of the items affected by the trade war is not that big. I just mentioned that $505 billion Chinese exports to the United States, only about $37 billion of that is affected so far. Another $16 billion is going to go online, and President Trump has threatened $200 billion more to go online. But right now, the amount is not that large. And I think there's also, while on paper United States does have the advantage, in reality, China has some potent weapons as well. They have, United States is right now going against not only China, but Mexico and EU and Canada. China has lower value added for their products. A lot of their exports are actually re-exports of parts from other countries, including the United States. And those are often made to order for American companies like Apple. And then China has maybe not in goods, but in services where they're importing a lot of American services, they can make life more difficult. They can make life more difficult for American companies coming into China, and China is a big market. It's going to get even bigger. In terms of purchasing power, not on paper, but on purchasing power, they're right now as big as the United States. So a lot of American companies want to go into China, but if China makes the life difficult, then they're not going to be at a disadvantage to European and Asian countries, which are more freer to get in.
There are concerns that the trade war will have negative effects on South Korea as well, seeing as China and the US are South Korea's biggest trade partners. But there are some reports that saying that perhaps it's a bit overblown and that South Korea will be fine anyway. But what is your view on this?
Okay, well, I think it's going to be on the lower side. The Korea International Trade Association did an estimate in April using the $50 billion figure, $50 billion trade war figure, and Korean exports only fell by about 0.3%. Ministry of Commerce, again, they did the figures based on $50 billion, and the amount of trade that was affected didn't even add up to $1 billion. So as long as the trade war does not expand, I think the effect will be small. And you also have to realize that while China does export an incredible amount of goods to the United States, it's only about 20% of their total exports. So I think a lot of the concerns are going to be somewhat overblown, but that does not mean that there won't be any harm at all. So there will be some negative effects. It will have effects on some particular industries, and for particular industries, it may even be devastating. But overall, I think perhaps we're getting too scared about the negative effects.
But I guess it could also snowball into something more significant and bigger as well.
Well, my biggest concern is whether this will snowball not only between China and US, but it'll affect other regions as well. For steel, European Union has raised its tariffs because they don't want all the cheap steel that used to go to the United States to come to Europe. And then the biggest concern I have is whether Trump will weaken the WTO system, which will be devastating not only for current economy, but economy in the future, not only for US, China, but for all countries.
Now, briefly, before we go, there's one more topic I wanted to ask your expertise on. Amidst all these concerns, figures have been released that saying the global debt now is at $247 trillion, according to numbers released by the Institute of International Finance. That's quite a worrying figure. I mean, it's being described as a global debt bomb. What do you make of this?
Okay, well, the thing about a bomb is you need a trigger. And as long as you don't have a trigger, it might not go off. So I think we don't want to be over concerned about this, but we do need to watch out because there are some potential triggers. For example, we have problems in finance, international finance in Venezuela and Turkey, which may blow up into a financial crisis. I think even if it does blow up to be a financial crisis in these regions, it'll be limited to the region because Venezuela and Turkey are not that big a country. But still, it's a potential trigger. And then another potential trigger is the United States, because not only because of the trade war, but this trade war is bound to raise American consumer prices. And if the Fed reacts to that and raises the interest rate faster, then that may act as a trigger. And then China, because of the trade war, they reduced the reserve requirement for their banks, subject to the condition that they lend more to small and medium-sized companies, which are weak. And this may make Chinese finance market even weaker than it is. That could serve as a trigger. But the thing about the trigger is that it may not be pulled. So we need to watch for it, but we perhaps don't need to be overly concerned about it.
So a bomb, which is there, but we just need to keep an eye on and something.
Make sure that no one pulls that trigger.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you for coming in today, and thank you for your time and your insights.
Thank you.
Now that concludes our show for today. To catch up on all our latest reports, you can check out our website arirang.com/news and tune into our later newscasts throughout the day as well, please. I'll be back tomorrow, and in the meantime, hope you're having a good day from wherever you are in the world. Thank you and goodbye.